Hello and welcome to another episode of Isn't That Something? I'm Ralph Crewe, and today we have a long-form interview video. I got to talk to a friend of mine who is also a brilliant engineer and professor at Carnegie Mellon University. She's just an inspiration to us all. Her name is Dr. Destenie Nock, and I'll let her describe all the cool stuff that she's been up to in the interview. So here we go.
Isn't that something? Isn't that something? Something.
So I'm really excited today to talk to someone I'm glad to be friends with, and someone who's inspirational and amazing and super smart and fun, Dr. Destenie Nock, a professor over at Carnegie Mellon University. Destenie, thank you for coming and talking to me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ralph.
So to get started, can you just give us a little background on what your role is at Carnegie Mellon, what you do?
Right, so I'm an assistant professor, and my role is really about doing research, getting grants, and teaching students, and probably in that order. So what we're doing first is we have a lot of research going on. I have about 6 PhD students that work with me right now, and 2 master's students and 4 undergrads. And our role is building energy models that can look at how future energy systems will impact our sustainability goals and our equality goals. So when we think about sustainability, we're thinking about water quality, air pollution, emission reduction, making sure that we can afford energy in the future. And when we're thinking about equality, we're really focused on making sure that everybody can afford energy, not just a select few. That energy, as it's distributed around the country, is going to create jobs. It's going to make sure we reduce air pollution across the country, not just in the few places where the rich live, right? And so we are really excited to be doing a lot of this work. And then a couple of my students are looking at transportation, because in the transportation sector, we're using a ton of energy as well. And that's where a lot of air pollution emissions happen. So we want to make sure everybody can access public transportation safely. We have a couple of COVID projects going on right now, looking at how public transit is impacting the safety of essential workers. And we're also looking at how, because of all the stay-at-home measures, that's impacted energy poverty in large metropolitan areas. Just from, you go home, now all of a sudden you're expected to do all your work from home, use the internet from home, when your employer would have normally paid for that. And that has a huge impact on people's energy bills because of the heating requirements in the winter, right? So now instead of your work providing most of the heat for you throughout the day, or the schools providing most of the heat for the children, now everybody's having to do that on their own, and it's very decentralized. Then getting grants. So I can't do any cool research without anybody paying me to do it and paying my students to do it. Right. So that's a big part, just trying to write these things in a way that conveys my passion, conveys that we are smart, qualified, and good enough to actually get the work done in a timely manner. And then last but not least is, of course, teaching students, which is funny because that's what everybody assumes the majority of my job is, right? And so that's about 40% of my job. And I teach an economic decision-making class where I teach students how to build mathematical models that can also incorporate social justice and environmental sustainability into those models to help them think about how their companies can make decisions one day while not leaving behind the members of society that they're trying to serve.
I think that's really important. A lot of folks will throw around words like sustainability, but the mathematical modeling you're doing to to both demonstrate where things are and to come up with solutions, I think is really fascinating. Can you tell us more about how you build these mathematical models?
Yeah, so it all starts with a question, right? So normally the question is something that we believe is simple, like how did energy poverty change in a metropolitan area? So let's say Arizona, for example, before and after COVID, right? So you're like, okay, yeah, that's fine. Let's just build a model that does that. Then you start looking into, okay, well, how can we measure people's energy use? How can we measure that change, right? So now you want to get into some of the calculus equations like derivatives and looking at curves and the temperature set point. We can also use people's energy data to find out when they start turning on their heating systems or their AC systems. So let's say that we're moving from winter into summer. eventually you'll start using your heat less and less and less. And then that's going to bring down your energy usage. Then all of a sudden at some outdoor temperature, maybe it's 70 degrees for you, maybe it's 75 degrees for me. We're going to start increasing the amount of energy that we're going to start to use for our AC units, right? And so then if we can find that bottom point, that minimization, that's when we're like, okay, that's when people start turning on their AC units, switching from heat to AC. So one thing that we were asking ourselves is, well, how has this changed in high income populations and low income populations? So now what we have to do is we have to separate these populations into the high income groups and low income groups, find that temperature change point for each person within the different groups, right? So now we're kind of working with upwards of 500,000 different people and different households on different days, right?
Yeah.
And trying to find these temperature change points for each person in each of these groups. And so then, we're going to get into some statistics, right? So we have to find the min, the median, the mode, find when most people are changing within the group, where's the average of the change within each of those groups. And then we want to take what we find now, understanding each of the low income group members and the high income group members, and see, well, how far apart is this variability? Right. And what we actually found is kind of under the Obama era, it was pretty close, right? Like maybe the high income groups and low income groups were maybe 2 degrees different. But then now, as we've kind of moved through our Trump presidency, we've gotten like much wider gap. So now it's about 7 degrees of difference when people start turning on their AC units. And so then, we can also look at this with COVID and how has COVID impacted people's vulnerability and their actual behavior of when they turn on these AC units. And so then we can start to tie these things with electricity mandates, electricity rebates, right? And understand how has energy poverty changed throughout the time period.
Now, the work you're talking about right now is all based mainly in the United States, but you've done some study in other areas as well. I mean, the U.S. certainly has its share of issues, but we do have a large infrastructure already in place. But that's not true worldwide. Can you tell me a bit about some of the earlier work you did as well? Because I remember you telling me about it, and I thought it was really neat.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've also been looking at is energy development in sub-Saharan Africa. And in my first project, the question that we were building off of was, if we had 2 different decision makers, how might they build power systems differently, given that they are going to care about equality and distribution of energy differently? So as an example, you might really value equality and say that I want to make sure that everybody can consume enough energy to power some lights. And I might say, well, I don't really care about equality. I just want to maximize the amount of energy in the system. And I just want to make sure that most people can use as much energy as they want. So then what we have to do is we have to try to turn those preferences into a mathematical function. So for the person that really cares about everybody having a small amount of energy, they're going to have what looks like a logarithmic curve. You get a really high benefit, right? So if you have your x-axis as the amount of energy that you're going to use and your y-axis as your happiness level, then you get a high happiness from everybody getting like a really small amount. And then when you start to give people more and more energy, you kind of curve it out and it starts to flatten. Right. So you get high happiness and then the happiness kind of tapers off. Right. So then for me, if I said that, well, I don't like care about equality, I just get equal amounts of happiness from people just consuming as much as they want, then it's going to be more of like a linear line. And my happiness is going to keep increasing no matter how much energy I'm giving, as long as the most people are getting it. Right. So then we put those 2 equations into the objective function, so the goal of our mathematical model, and we set some constraints. So we say, okay, well, now we have a certain level of demand that must be met across the regions. Or we also have some cost constraints, right? You can't just build power plants for free. So we have cost for hydro, oil, solar. We threw some battery technology in there. Also, we put in locations of where people live, right? You have to make sure the demand actually goes somewhere. And we see that if you have a person that really cares about equality, then you do reach universal access targets and that Sustainable Development Goal 7 of universal access much sooner. It does take a long time because power plants are really expensive, especially in countries that don't have large energy systems already. But if you have the person that doesn't care about equality, then you just build large power plants in the very large cities and you fill in whatever little budget you have left with solar home systems. So you give people just a little bit of energy during the day, and then you just call it good. And it takes you a lot longer to reach the universal access goal. So actually, I ran my model assuming that I would give people 30 years to reach the energy access goal, and they just never met it when they didn't care about equality. So that, does drive some of the push for these rural electrification programs, right? It pushes, it kind of reinstills the need for that universal access target, Sustainable Development Goal 7. But it also, speaks to the need for valuing infrastructure, right? So you can't just say we're going to deploy solar or hydro. You have to deploy transmission lines too,
Right.
Because yeah.
So I think it's the world of power is so much more interesting than it used to be because there's so many options. What does the future of power generation look like to you? And what would you like it to look like if you had your druthers?
So I think that the future of power generation, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is going to look very diverse because we are already seeing this, what they call the utility death spiral. So in the US, right, the utilities were these conglomerates and they just ran everything. And then when people started saying, well, I want my own solar panels on my house, or I want my community to have its own wind turbine, that's when we had this death spiral of the utilities profits. But in sub-Saharan Africa, they already have that utility death spiral because so many people are not wanting to wait those 30 years for the utilities to build out these very large systems. So people already have diesel generators, they have this solar home systems. And when the utility actually does come into their town, they want to keep both systems because the utility is often considered to be unreliable, meaning that they might experience a couple of power outages per week, as opposed to, where we experience it in the US, like per year, maybe one or two when, we have some storm or something like that. So there's definitely going to be this trend of people keeping their own utility backup systems. I think that we're also seeing that trend in California with the system-wide blackouts from the wildfires and people now looking to get their own diesel generators, their own solar home systems, and things like that. There is a challenge with the decentralized systems that then now you have to take ownership of actually knowing the maintenance, keeping those things stocked, right? So when you have this backup power, I do think that a lot of people aren't going to want to have to learn all the ins and outs. So I think that we're going to end up having this new market of people that travel around taking care of these smaller systems. Now, what I hope the future will look like is an equitable one, because right now we are seeing that most people that have solar home systems or these solar panels on their roofs are homeowners, and they're typically pretty wealthy, right? And we know that a lot of low-income populations are renters. So I do hope that eventually there is a push for, deployment of these technologies among landlords and among the housing stock, because I don't think that we want to get to that future where we leave out the most vulnerable members of society.
No, for sure. I would love to see solar panels in a rental situation like that. I think that sounds good. Do you feel like solar, small scale solar, I guess, like solar on individual homes, is something that's going to continue growing? I know I've seen it much more frequently over the last 10, 15 years. Does that seem like a trend you think will keep going?
I do think that it will keep going, but we are going to start running into challenges because the people that benefit the most from putting solar on their homes, from like the lower costs and things like that, are the first adopters, right? The early adopters, because right now we have a lot of high cost oil, high cost coal, and natural gas. Natural gas is cheaper, but still we have those fossil fuels, right? But once you start phasing out those fossil fuels, the energy prices are going to fall, and then you're not going to get as many benefits, right? Also, I think that solar does come with its challenges because the current way that most people pay for their energy is on a per unit of energy basis, meaning that you only pay for the amount of energy that you use. But with solar, right, you're using less, so you're paying the grid less. And what the challenge is that the transmission and distribution lines have to be there regardless of how much energy you're using. So I do think that eventually we're going to get to this point where they actually change the pricing structure, because now when as wealthy or families are switching off the grid, now we're making low income populations pay more and more and more for their electricity. So that's one reason why you get some of these complaints about people saying that, we're deploying solar and my costs are still not cheaper, right? And it's because a lot of that residential solar people switching off means that the people that are stuck on the grid, right, those renters, people that live in apartment complexes, people that don't own the roof that they live under, right, they're stuck there. And so then somebody still has to pay for the poles, the wires, if somebody runs into those poles, if squirrels, eat the wires, right? Somebody still has to pay for that, regardless of whether or not you're using the energy. And I think that just, the way that we're paying for energy now isn't going to be sustainable in the long run.
No, that makes sense to me. How did you get into all of this? I mean, it is so fascinating. I think these are some of the world's huge pressing issues that need solutions, and I'm really glad you're working on it. But I'm sure you didn't just wake up one day saying, I want to study power distribution and equity and things like that. How did you end up here?
So when I was in high school, right, thinking about what college major to choose, I really wanted to be a high school math teacher.
Nice.
Just because I thought that was going to be the way that I could change the world. I'm going to change the world one kid at a time. And when I sent off my application, they sent it back to me saying that I had been accepted into the applied mathematics program. And I was like, nobody changes me without asking me. I was a very mad 17-year-old, right? And my dad was just telling me okay, well, you can get a scholarship for being an engineer. You should be an engineer because I'm an engineer. So I said, sure. Okay, fine. I'll just switch and get the scholarship, because they also didn't give me a scholarship for applied math. And so I switched to electrical engineering because that's what my dad did. So then I moved through college for 3 or 4 years trying to find what do I like about engineering, right? Because most of the time people are like, oh, you should be an engineer because you can build cool stuff, right? And I'm like, I don't really care about building cool stuff. I just want to help somebody. I want to know that when I leave this earth, that I mattered, that the work that I did, it mattered to somebody more than just making some big company money, right? So then I went to Malawi, Africa on a study abroad, and I went there to teach kids math and to also teach them how to sew these reusable feminine pads that I came up with just because I heard a lot of girls were dropping out of school. And while I was there, that was my first time that I experienced rolling blackouts. The blackouts where the government says, hey, you're going to get a blackout on Tuesday, right? So then Tuesday comes and goes, and I'm like, oh, great. We didn't actually get that blackout. So then on Thursday, I'm trying to talk to my parents, haven't talked to them in probably the whole weeks since I had been there. And then the power just cuts off, right? I'm just
oh, man.
Oh my goodness. I just lost $20. And to me, $20 felt like a lot of money at that time, because I was, broke college student. And I just remember going and trying to get my money for the Wi-Fi card back. And the guy's like, nope, your money's gone. Government blackout just came. And so then I was like, why are we still dealing with this in 2012? Because 2012, we should not have rolling blackouts. And then lo and behold, I found out that there's just a ton of people that don't have electricity in the first place, right? So that's what really kind of put me at this dichotomy of should I still continue down this path of being a teacher, or should I, kind of switch and do power systems? I really started wanting to do both. So then a year after that, I had the unfortunate experience of one of my really, really close friends in college passing away. So he had cancer, and he got cancer in the end of his freshman year. So we were both freshmen together. Oh. And then, he was gone about 3.5 years later. And that just made me really question what I was doing with my life. I had been working at ExxonMobil at the time, and I just didn't really feel like I was on the right path. And then, right before that had happened, I also had taught in the high school. It did not go well. Like high
No.
schoolers are very mean.
They are.
Yeah, they are very mean. They did not care about any of the games I tried to bring into the classroom or like how I was teaching them. And I also felt like I kind of was set up to fail because I was trying to teach algebra 2 to people that were still in algebra 1. Right. So
Oh.
then I was just like, oh my goodness, that No Child Left Behind Act is really messing up these kids, right? This is why kids don't like math, because we put them in classes they're really not prepared for.
Mm-hmm.
So those two things happening very close together just kind of made me think, okay, let me go to find what I like in engineering. And that's when I really got into this like power systems track. And I also applied to graduate school to try to figure out like who plans the power system. Right, I was in electrical engineering in undergrad, so that's when you learn about like the mechanics behind the power system and you kind of build the equipment. But the actual planners of the power system, I learned later, were industrial engineers, right? And so then I applied to graduate school and I got admitted to UMass Amherst, where I worked with this woman named Dr. Erin Baker for 4 years, building electricity models and learning how to measure things like sustainability, how to look at trade-offs between different sustainability objectives, even though they have different units, right? Because how can you tell if 1 unit of air pollution emissions is going to be more important than 1 liter of water, right? When you're trying to impact these different things that we really care about. And then also I got to learn that no technology is perfect. Right. And I think that that's something that's been so important because, wind energy also has its struggles with birds, offshore wind energy, when you're drilling those foundations, has issues with whales and sharks and, just tourism. How can you tell somebody that, you're going to come in and disrupt their job and their livelihood to put an energy source offline that they personally don't feel like they benefit from? Right. So there's just a lot of energy, issues, and trying to learn how to balance those trade-offs, I think, is something that I uniquely bring to my research program.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly challenging to weigh everything and make a good decision. It feels like it'd be really easy to put too much emphasis on one aspect of these problems and then miss some of the other complications that come along with it.
Yeah, and I think that it's about trying to find that trade-off and let people know what trade-offs they're making because, let's say that we're looking at air pollution in the US. In a lot of places, we have pretty good air quality. But if you take that same question, you put in Beijing, for example, right, then it starts to become a different trade-off. And it really depends on like the starting point of people, right? If I'm talking about water quality in like New York, for example, that's going to be different than talking about water quality in Flint, Michigan, because we're at different starting points. People have different histories. They have different things that they care about. And I think that when we're looking at energy systems, we just need to make sure that we're empowering people to make their own decisions. So that's why in my work, oftentimes we try not to just say, here's the single best mix of power plants and energy sources that your system or your region is going to need. We say, okay, well, here's 10 options. Okay. And here are the trade-offs you're going to get with each of these 10 options so that you can make the decision, right? The decision makers can make the decision, the stakeholders, the policymakers, whoever. That way, you are empowering people. And that kind of gets back to our central mission in my group of equality, right? So it's not just about, academics or the researchers having all of the knowledge. It's about making sure that knowledge is digestible and handed over so that you can empower people.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there are people who are watching or listening who want to learn more and want to empower themselves, what would you say to them? How would you recommend people dig in deeper?
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of people trying to make this, science, this world of energy modeling a little bit more accessible. I've posted a couple of videos on my own personal YouTube page, and I run a blog where I do tell people about different things that my group's working on. I also run a blog, some blog posts where I have, graduate student advice or just success and career advice for people in general. And then I think that energy Twitter has really made a lot of this stuff accessible because people just have to say what they need to say in 180 characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so you learn how to say it in a very, succinct, hopefully clear way. So I actually have found a lot of interesting reports through Twitter and Energy Twitter. And I try to repost some things, but I've also just started following a lot more people.
Oh, that's excellent. And I'll make sure to include links to all that stuff in the description of the video. And if you're listening on the audio only form, that'll also be in the description. Destenie, is there anything else that you think we should know about your work that you've been doing?
So I think that with my work, we are constantly changing. We're always adapting. So if people out there feel like, there's a big energy question that we've missed that they're like, we're super passionate about, I'm always happy to hear those things. You can message me on Twitter. It's just at Dr. Destenie Nock. And I'm always super happy to hear about what people think are the most pressing challenges. And then one other thing I will add is when I was getting into the energy sector and trying to learn a lot, I started listening to the Energy Transition Show podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Each of their episodes has a geek rating, which is really nice because sometimes, it helps you not get trapped in something way too technical.
Sure.
But, through that podcast, I did learn a lot about the history of energy transition in the U.S. and just got to know some current events, right? I think they even have one on the Biden-Harris climate transition plan. They had one on like nuclear power plants. So if nothing else, I hope that people kind of leave this episode just knowing that one technology isn't going to get us there to the future that we want. It's about learning how to use a combination of technologies in a sustainable way, right? So a lot of times people talk to me about, I only support renewable energy. I'm like, okay, great. If you support wind energy, you really have to support transmission lines because the wind is often not where people live.
Mm-hmm.
If you support hydro, right, you need to support fish as well, because oftentimes these, you're turning what's a river into a lake, right? So now we have to think about fish and downstream impacts on farmers because now you've shrunk that riverbank, right? So it's not just about those few technologies that we love, that we hold dear to our hearts. It's about making sure that we can all work together to make the energy system what we really want it to be.
Yeah, I love that. It's like, it's not as simple as just like pick one green energy and just be a champion for that. But it is still achievable. And I think that you're making a huge impact on people's abilities to make these decisions, and also, of course, on the larger system. So, Destenie, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ralph. It was great talking to you too.
Huge thanks again to Dr. Destenie Nock for taking time to talk to me. What an amazing person and what incredible work she does. If you'd like to learn more about what she's up to, I will leave links to all of her stuff that she mentioned in the description of the video or the description of the podcast if you are listening to this in an ears only format. If you like Isn't That Something, please like, share, subscribe. If you really enjoy the show, please consider supporting me on Patreon. That is definitely the best way to show how much you enjoy the show. We'll be back with a normal short form episode later on this week. Thanks for watching or listening, and explore the universe responsibly.
Isn't that something? Isn't that something?